When you start to understand the way the neurochemicals of your brain work, you know what you should actually be doing. Where should you be? How should you be working? Where will you thrive? Where will you fail? And to your point, knowing this for a child, you can literally map out the optimal life for them. Here's exactly the choices you should make for mood, for health, for energy, for sports, for career. Should you be an accountant? Yes or no? Can you be a doctor? Can you see blood and walk away? Or is it going to cause trauma to you? Literally, genetically, we can determine that. Right? We've worked with the US military on their Black Ops special forces who should actually be frontline deployed that won't come back with PTSD. Who can actually not hesitate and pull the trigger. We've literally done that work with the military. So to that degree, imagine knowing this about your child, which is why I've done it for my own kids.
Yeah. Well, traditionally, maybe not that last bit of hyper focus on every specific detail, but prior to you sharing that bit, it's like that kid traditionally would be diagnosed with ADD or ADHD, attention hyper, disorder. And now they're going to give him a cascade of drugs, which is going to create a whole nother, cascade of neurochemicals in his brain. And it's just going to probably overregulate, overstimulate all these other things. And it's like, how many young boys and young girls these days are that same exact example or similar that have just been misdiagnosed, mistreated, and now you're causing deeper problems because you're Band-Aid, 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 and essentially this kid's going to get to high school and he's just going to blow up or whatever.
Yeah, and that thing, the worst part about that is that thing that we're trying to mask with pills and a name, ADHD, is actually their superpower. That's actually the thing that if they understood what they had and used it in the right context is the reason they would do better than anyone else.
I love that. And it brings to something that you said earlier. And I want to circle back and spend a little bit of time here if we can, because I made a comment on a podcast recently, probably about 6-7 episodes ago. And this is based upon the work that I've done. This is based on my own life experience, that I believe addicts, like anybody that's struggling with a compulsion, with pornography, drugs, sex, whatever it is, like if there's a behavior that's got you wrapped up, you are in fact a high performer in my eyes. You just haven't yet directed it in the right channel. And you made that comment about depression, anxiety, the same gene that is causing that oftentimes causes entrepreneurship. So talk about that if you can. I'd like to spend some time there.
Yeah, so that for me was one of the biggest aha moments in going from a consumer of genetic testing to a purveyor and like, this is my legacy. I got to work on this because it solved my problems. So what did I learn? What is the root of addiction is dopamine, pleasure, right? So how we all deal with that is different. The genetics of it are very clear. And the last piece then becomes context. So let's use me as an example. When it comes to dopamine, there's 3 phases. There's the anticipation. I know this is coming. I smell the tasty pizza and I know I'm going to get it and I start to feel pleasure. Then there's the moment I bite into it like, oh, that eureka, like, wow, this is so good. And then there's a clearance. My brain needs to get back to normal and go about my day. That's kind of the 3 phases of pleasure. And most chemical experiences of the brain, they have these sort of 3 phases. The way we do that genetically, there's a gene called DRD2, which I mentioned earlier, which determines the density of your receptors in your brain. To what degree do I anticipate and feel? Then there's a gene called MAO, which breaks the dopamine down, right? Starts to metabolize it. Then there's a gene called COMT, which is like the broom that comes and sweeps it away, right? So I have the lowest possible density of receptors in my brain, and I have the fastest MAO and the fastest COMT, which means I feel it way down here. I hardly feel it, and it's kind of done before it even started. So what's the outcome for me? If I do nothing, it's depression because I just don't get to feel what other people feel. If I do something, it's probably addiction because I'm going to find something that gives me pleasure, but it's never enough. So I'm going to want more and more and more. Addiction is very different than binging. I'm going to talk about that in a second. So addiction is like I need more and more, and I structure my day around it, and it becomes a routine, and eventually I burn out and kill myself in this thing. Or achievement. Why? Because dopamine not only powers pleasure, it also powers reward. That feeling of accomplishment and reward. I did something good at work. That feeling that you get, that high, that's dopamine also. What you need is satisfaction. And it can come from pleasure or reward. If you're not getting reward, you're probably going to lean on pleasure. It's a lot easier. So the context then becomes the outcome. For me, I've experienced all three. I've experienced depression growing up in poverty and not having a life that was enjoyable and seeing my friends and peers. I've experienced addiction and gone down the pleasure route, and like many people in my family have. But now, knowing this, I'm going down the achievement route. Even when it comes to things that give me pleasure, like food, I've learned now how to treat them like reward, right? I've replaced the food that I enjoy, which would have used to be about pleasure, the challenge now of eating the right amount, of not having too much oil or whatever the thing is I'm thinking about in that current meal. This weekend, I was stuck in a restaurant eating fish and chips because there was no other option for me, peeling the crust off to make sure I didn't eat all that extra crap. That sense of reward replaced the sense of pleasure. You just need satisfaction, and you can get it from either source, right? So now the context and understanding of how you behave allows you to go from addict to achievement or entrepreneur or whatever you want to call this bucket. Then there's a flip opposite. What if I have the maximum density of dopamine receptors and a very slow clearance? Then all of a sudden, it's very easy for me to experience pleasure and reward. I'm always satisfied. So it would sound like that person would never is like kind of has the antidote to addiction, right? Because why would they suffer from addiction? Why? Because when you have the slow clearance and you're experiencing things at an elevated level, it's hard to let them go. An addict can do their thing and they can walk away once they've done their thing. They can maybe move on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. The binger, once they feel that feeling, they get lost. 6, 7, 8 hours. It's a difference between I have to watch Netflix on time every single day or I get frustrated, or when I watch Netflix, I watch 8 episodes till 4 in the morning. Both are driven by pleasure and reward, very different sort of outcomes. So for this person, they often have the destruction and problems that come from addiction, but they don't get called an addict. But, and it's not like I need to drink. I need to drink a very particular whiskey. That's the one that I like. And when I find that one, I'm going to drink the whole bottle because they get stuck in that pleasure. They're very picky about their pleasure, right? Same thing with their entrepreneurialism. They're not the person that should be the entrepreneur and take shifting gears and wearing multiple hats. They should be the subject matter expert, the author, the scientist that can binge and dive deep and go lock themselves in the lab for 8 hours and come back with this giant stack of paper like this, like, look what I did, right? So you start to understand who you are, and all of a sudden the same thing that's a crutch equals your superpower.
No, I love that. I mean, I'm just thinking across, like, I've been in the entrepreneurship space now I've been running businesses, starting companies for 10 years, really deep in the events, seminars, online kind of marketing space for a long time. I'm just thinking about all the guys that I know, like, oh, that's why those two guys are partners. You have the subject matter expert, like the one that knows the information. Then you got the guy behind it that's driving the bus, that's pulling all the levers. This is registering so much.
And there's so much more to it. Like, I'm just picking on a couple layers. When it comes to addiction and pleasure, there's so much more we can talk about. And this is why when you're dealing with like an addiction clinic, or there's multiple treatments for multiple different people. How do you know what you need? So it could be emotional. There's a gene called ADR2B that determines how well you deal with negative stimulus and trauma. And if you don't deal with that well, your family could have an experience, a car crash. 3 out of 4 people, no problem. That fourth person, it's the reason they get into addiction. But they're not addicted because of the dopamine. They're addicted because of the escape. Because they can't live on that street anymore. Every time they see that intersection, they feel the pain, right? So they need the escape. So that person needs a very different solution. What they need to realize is they're an emotionally brilliant person. They can access emotion and recall emotion in a way other people can't. When they think about the problem, they can literally remember the feeling. They hold the grudge. Right? They literally can bring back the feeling viscerally, like it just happened. And that's what PTSD and trauma is. But they need to use that to their advantage and be the emotional leader, be the the guide, the rock that everyone leans on, because you're kind of wise about your decisions. You don't make the same mistake twice. But put that in the wrong context, it's going to lead to problems because it's going to be a burden of pain. And then there's so many of these examples I can get into, but all I'm saying is that you can personalize. You can know your why, right? The word addiction is far too general.